Bonnie and Clyde Prologue in the shadow of the Great Depression, where dusty roads wound through an America filled with poverty and lost dreams. A love story was born that would become legendary. Two young souls, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, met in West Dallas, bound by a longing for freedom and revenge against a system that crushed the weak. Their saga began with a cup of hot chocolate on a chilly evening in 1930, a spark that would ignite a fire of passion, crime, and blood. Shadows of childhood and fading dreams on March 24, 1909, beneath a sky as blue as a freshly washed cotton shirt in the vast fields outside Tellico, Ellis County, Texas, Clyde Chestnut Barrow let out his first cry into the world. The air was thick with the damp scent of earth, and the wind carried promises of a future that would prove to be nothing but a lie. He was the fifth of 7 children born to Henry Basil Barrow, a farmer with weather-beaten hands that battled drought and endless debts, and Kumi Talitha Walker, a woman whose faith in God was the only thread holding the family together in their simple shack. The cotton fields stretched like a sea of white and green, but the yield barely covered the bread on the table. As the Great Depression began to sink its teeth into the land in the 1920s, with banks collapsing like dominoes and factories slamming doors on desperate workers, the Barrow family packed their meager belongings, a wagon, a few blankets, and hope as thin as a spider's web. They boarded a train to Dallas, a city that promised jobs but delivered slums and starvation. In West Dallas, the urban maze of cramped alleys and smoky factories, they landed in a world of misery. At first, they lived under their wagon, rain dripping through the canvas tarp on stormy nights, then in a tent that fluttered in the wind from the Trinity River. Finally, after months of begging and odd jobs, they secured a small house in the Eastham area, a shack with a leaking roof and walls that creaked with every gust. Clyde, with his lanky hair falling into his eyes and a smile that hid an inner fire, ran barefoot through the alleys, stealing apples from the neighbor's tree and dreaming of the cars that sped by on the dusty roads. He loved the jazz that snuck out from radios in the evenings, drums pounding like a heartbeat in his chest, and the freedom to run faster than any other boy in the neighborhood. "One day I'll own a Ford, one that flies like the wind," he told his sister Marie as they sat on the porch steps, sharing a stolen apple pie. But school was a cage for a soul that yearned for more. By age 16, he dropped out, weary of lessons' shackles, and took odd jobs as a dishwasher in a diner where grease clung to his skin or a street vendor where the sun baked his back. Soon he was drawn into the whirlwind of crime, like a moth to flame. On November 23, 1926, he was arrested for the first time. He hadn't returned a rented car on time, and the Dallas police laughed at the young thief with the defiant gaze. "Freedom is everything," he whispered to himself in the cold cell as the chains bit into his wrists. More arrests followed, stolen turkeys hidden under coats with his big brother Buck as they snuck through the dark, safe-cracking explosions where dynamite boomed like thunder, and car thefts that gave a rush of adrenaline. Prison was hell on earth for Clyde. The guards' whips left scars that burned like fire, and nights filled with screams from men who took what they wanted in the shadows. A few miles away, in the small town of Rowena, Texas, Bonnie Elizabeth Parker entered the world on October 1, 1910. Her father, Charles Robert Parker, a mason with strong arms that could lift stones like feathers and a heart full of dreams for a better life, held her in his arms and sang a lullaby with a voice trembling with love. "Our little star," he called her, rocking her in the simple wooden house surrounded by cotton fields. But fate was cruel as an unexpected storm. Charles died of pneumonia in 1914, only 4 years later, leaving behind a widow and 3 children in a world already harsh on the weak. Emma Crawes Parker, Bonnie's mother, was a rock in the tempest, tough as leather, with eyes that burned with determination and hands that sewed clothes night after night under a flickering lantern. She packed up the home, sold what little they owned, and took the train to West Dallas, to her parents in Cement City, the industrial suburb where the air was thick with coal smoke and the roar of machines. Cement City was a labyrinth of small houses and factories, where children played among garbage heaps and women bent over sewing machines. Emma sewed garments to support the family, skirts, shirts, anything that could be sold for a nickel. And Bonnie, the second of three siblings, grew up helping, her small fingers flying over the fabric. She was sharp as a whip, with a mind that absorbed books and poetry like a thirsty plant drinks water. As a little girl, she stood on a wooden crate in the yard, surrounded by neighbor kids with dirt-streaked faces, reciting poems with a voice that carried like a bird over the rooftops. "One day I'll stand on a stage in Hollywood with spotlights shining like the sun," she told her mother, brushing her dark hair in front of a cracked mirror, dreams glittering in her eyes. School was easy for her. She wrote verses about love and freedom, about hearts that broke and souls that soared, and teachers nodded approvingly. But West Dallas was no place for dreams. The depression hung like a weight over everything, with factories closing and men wandering the streets hungry, their eyes empty as burnt-out embers. Radios buzzed with news of bank crashes and starving families. The Dallas Morning News reported daily on evictions and soup kitchens, and Bonnie listened with wide eyes as she helped Emma with dinner, a thin soup of beans and potatoes. "Why is the world so unfair, Mama? Why do we have to fight for every crumb?" she asked one evening, her voice filled with an anger that already burned inside. At 15, she met Roy Thornton at a dance in Dallas. Jazz pulsed through the smoky room, drums like heartbeats, saxophone wailing like a sigh of longing. Roy was older, charming with his mischievous grin and stories of adventures beyond the horizon. He promised her the stars, but delivered only lies. They married on September 25, 1926, just 6 days before her 16th birthday. The wedding was simple as a black-and-white dream. A pastor in a small church, a few witnesses in ill-fitting clothes, and vows of eternal love echoing off bare walls. But Roy was a wanderer, always on the move with pockets sticky from petty thefts, and their home became a place of empty beds and silent nights. They separated in January 1929, but Bonnie never removed her wedding ring. It hung like a chain on her finger, a reminder of shattered dreams and a heart yearning for more. After the separation, she moved back with her mother and took a job as a waitress at a diner in Dallas, a place where the coffee was black as night and the plates flecked with grease. She smiled at customers, businessmen with crooked ties, workers with hands smelling of oil, poured coffee into chipped cups, and wiped tables with a rag that stuck to her skin. "A smile pays the bills," she told herself, but inside, a fire of restlessness burned. One regular customer was Ted Hinton, a postal worker with kind eyes and a laugh that warmed like sunshine. Ironically, he would later join the Dallas County Sheriff's Department in 1932 and become part of the posse that shot her dead. At 18, Bonnie wrote in her diary, pen trembling against the paper, "Dallas chokes me like a thick fog. Every day is the same, empty plates, fake smiles, and a longing that gnaws at my chest. When will my chance come? I love photography, capturing the moment before it flees like a shadow." She borrowed a camera from a neighbor and posed in front of the mirror, dramatic as a silent film star, hair falling in waves over her shoulders, eyes burning with a fire the world had yet to know. Meetings that ignite the spark and chains that break on January 5, 1930, everything changed forever. It was a chilly evening in West Dallas, at 105 Herbert Street, in the home of Clarence Clay, a friend of Clyde's whose house smelled of fried bacon and moonshine. Bonnie was there to care for a friend with a broken arm. She stood in the cramped kitchen, stirring a pot of hot chocolate, steam rising like a warm mist, filling the room with sweet scent. The door creaked open, cutting through the silence, and Clyde stepped in, 20 years old, with lanky hair falling across his forehead and an intense gaze that bored into the soul. Their eyes met over the pot's warmth, and time froze, hearts beating in sync, an electric charge in the air. "Who are you?" she asked, voice soft but curious, extending a cup of chocolate. He grinned, removing his slouch hat and leaning against the doorframe. "Someone who hates cold nights and loves hot chocolate. And you, an angel in this hell of a city." They talked all night, words flowing like a river after rain, about dreams suffocated by poverty, hatred for a system that trampled the weak like insects, and how life felt like a cage with locks of steel and keys held by others. Love struck like lightning, hot and merciless, a storm that uprooted everything and left them breathless. "You're the only one who sees me, who sees through the facade," Bonnie whispered as they sat on the cold kitchen floor, hands intertwined, fingers dancing against each other's skin. Clyde kissed her hand, and in that moment, something was born that neither law nor death could break, but freedom was fragile as glass. Weeks later, Clyde was arrested for car theft in Waco. Police stormed in at night, handcuffs cold and unrelenting. The McLennan County Jail was a nightmare of concrete walls and echoing screams. Bonnie smuggled a gun in her shoe during a visit, her heart pounding like a drum of fear and love. On March 11, 1930, he escaped, shots echoing through the dark corridors like a freedom fanfare, and for a moment, the world felt infinite. He hid with her for days. Their first night together was a storm of passion, kisses tasting of sweat and desperation, bodies melting into one in the small room. "Us against the world, baby," he murmured against her neck as moonlight filtered through the grimy curtains. But happiness was fleeting. On March 18, he was recaptured and on April 8, sent to Huntsville State Prison, then to Eastham Prison Farm in September 1930 at age 21. There the worst happened, scarring his soul forever. Guards and inmates assaulted him in the dark, taking what they wanted with violence like a knife in the back. In self-defense, he killed one of his tormentors with an iron pipe, a blow that crushed the skull with a sound echoing in his nightmares. His first murder, but another inmate, sentenced to life, took the blame to protect the young man. To avoid the brutal field labor, where the sun blistered skin to blisters and chains cut into ankles, he had 2 toes on his left foot amputated in late January 1932, either with his own hand or with a fellow inmate's help, the pain consuming him from within. "It was that or die of exhaustion, day after day in that damn sun," he muttered later to his mother, voice hard as stone. Clyde Barrow fought like a lioness for her son's release, writing letters to the governor with hands trembling from tears, pleading and praying until the walls echoed. On February 2, 1932, Clyde was paroled, just 6 days after the amputation, limping out the gate with a rage boiling beneath the surface. He was no longer the boy from Tellico, the one who stole apples for fun. "Something terrible happened to him in there," his sister Marie said later, voice broken with grief. "He transformed from a schoolboy to a rattlesnake, ready to strike." Inmate Ralph Fultz described it as a change from an innocent dreamer to a man driven by revenge. Bonnie waited in a stolen car outside the gate, her heart a tangle of fear and longing, hair fluttering in the wind. They drove off into the dawn, toward a life on the roads, wind in their hair and freedom like a drug tasting sweeter than honey. Clyde now hated the prison system with a passion burning like hellfire. "They'll pay for every scar they gave me," he swore, loading his favorite weapon, the M1918 Browning automatic rifle, the bar, which he called his chatter gun, with a crooked smile. The gang formed like a shadow in the night, quick and relentless. At first, it was just the two, Bonnie and Clyde, driving through Texas nights with radios buzzing jazz and distant warnings of bank heists in far-off states. Soon, Ralph Fultz and Ross Dyer joined, tough men with scars from their own battles. They robbed small stores and gas stations to gather weapons and cash, Clyde plotting an uprising at Eastham, revenge gnawing at him like a serpent. On April 19, 1932, it went wrong in Kaufman, Texas. Bonnie and Fultz snuck into a hardware store under night cover, air thick with tension, hearts pounding like drums as they grabbed rifles and ammo. Police stormed in like a tempest, shots whistled through the air, and Bonnie was arrested, handcuffs cold against her wrists like ice. In her cell at Kaufman County Jail, she sat on the hard bench, staring through bars at the stars, writing poetry on an old checkbook with a pencil stub. Poetry from life's other side. "Here I sit, a prisoner in chains of steel, but my soul flies free over fields and rivers," she versified, words a comfort in the dark. A grand jury freed her after months, evidence insufficient, witnesses wavering, but freedom tasted bitter as ash, and reuniting with Clyde felt like every breath a victory. On April 30, 1932, they claimed their first kill. Store owner J.N. Butcher in Hillsborough, Texas, shot during a robbery in his small shop, blood dark against the floorboards while Clyde waited in the getaway car, engine rumbling low. Butcher's wife identified him from photos later, voice shaking with hate. It was him, that devil with the cold eyes. Tension rose like fever. Every night, Bonnie woke from dreams of gunfire, sweat cold on her skin, Clyde's arms a shield around her. In summer 1932, Raymond Hamilton joined, a tough guy with tattoos telling tales of prison hell over a bottle of moonshine by the campfire. On August 5, at a dance in Stringtown, Oklahoma, they drank under the stars, music pulsing like a heartbeat, jazz mingling with locals' laughter. Sheriff C.G. Maxwell and Deputy Eugene C. Moore approached in the dark, suspicious of illegal liquor, flashlights cutting through the night. Clyde and Hamilton fired in panic. Moore fell with a muffled scream. The first lawman killed, blood dark against the earth, Maxwell gravely wounded with shots to the arm and leg. Clyde laughed nervously as they fled in the stolen car, tires screeching on gravel, but Bonnie wept silently in the back seat, tears hot on her cheeks. What have we become, Clyde? Killers in the night's shadow, fall 1932, exploded like a bomb. On October 11, they were suspected in the murder of Howard Hall in Sherman, Texas, a store owner shot cold during a robbery, though historians doubt their involvement due to lack of evidence. On Christmas Eve 1932, 16-year-old W.D. Jones joined, a childhood friend of the Barrows with wide eyes and a will to prove himself, full of youthful zeal. On December 25, they stole a car from Doyle Johnson in Temple, Texas. Jones shot him in the back in panic, blood splattering against the thin snow falling that night, a red pattern against the white. Bonnie cried that night in Clyde's arms, tears a flood of guilt, but he comforted her with whispers. It's us against the world now, baby. They made us this way, but we'll survive together. News spread like wildfire in dry grass, radios in homes across the country buzzing with warnings and sensational tales. On January 7, 1933, the Dallas Morning News reported in bold headlines, "Barrow Gang kills again, 5 victims since April, a wave of blood across Texas." In movie theaters, newsreels showed dramatic reconstructions, and a reporter in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram wrote, "They're ghosts on the roads, striking like lightning and vanishing in the dust, leaving fear and legend in their wake." On January 6, 1933, they stumbled into a police raid in Dallas, a trap for another criminal. Tarrant County Deputy Malcolm Davis was shot dead in the garage, shots echoing through the night like doomsday bells, the gang fleeing with hearts pounding. The gang had now killed 5 since April 1932, and the FBI, then the Bureau of Investigation, traced a stolen Ford from Illinois to them via a prescription bottle for Clyde's aunt in Nacogdoches, Texas, leading to a federal warrant on May 20, 1933, for interstate car theft. In March 1933, Buck Barrow was released after a full pardon, joining with his wife Blanche at a temporary hideout at 334712 Oak Ridge Drive in Joplin, Missouri, on March 22. They'd planned to convince Clyde to surrender, but instead stayed, caught in the whirl of parties, beer flowing, card games at midnight, and bar shots ricocheting off walls like fireworks. On April 13, 1933, police raided, suspicious of bootleggers after complaints of noise and an accidental discharge of Clyde's rifle. The shootout was chaos in the dark. Detective Harry L. McGinnis died instantly with a shot to the heart. Constable J.W. Harriman fell with fatal chest wounds. Bonnie fired her bar, bullets whistling through the air like hail, forcing Sergeant G.B. Carla to duck behind a tree, wood splinters hitting his face like sharp needles. They fled in panic, leaving a treasure trove of evidence: Buck's pardon papers, weapons, Bonnie's poem, Suicide Salve scrawled on wrinkled paper, and a roll of undeveloped film with posing photos. The Joplin Globe developed the films the next day, and the images spread like a storm via telegraph wires. Bonnie with a cigar in her mouth and gun in hand, posing like a movie star on a rocking chair, Clyde with the bar over his shoulder and a crooked smile, Blanche and Buck in jodhpurs like gangsters. Cigar-smoking gun Moll and her desperate lover, the paper wrote, and the photos became iconic, symbols of forbidden love in the Depression's shadow. Jeff Ginn later wrote in Go Down Together. John Dillinger had matinee idol looks, and Pretty Boy Floyd the best nickname. But the Joplin photos introduced new criminal superstars with the most exciting brand of all, illicit sex. Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker were wild and young, and undoubtedly slept together. Chicago radio echoed with sensational broadcasts. The public loves them, they're romantics on the run, rebels against an unjust system. In theaters, The Public Enemy with James Cagney inspired Clyde to pose with guns like a Hollywood gangster, and newspapers drew cartoons of Bonnie as a fallen angel with a pistol in hand and fire in her eyes. The road to chaos. Robberies, kidnappings, and wounds that never heal. In May 1933, they robbed banks in Lucerne, Indiana, on May 21, a failed attempt where shots flew but bills escaped, and succeeded in Oakabna, Minnesota, days later, cash raining into bags as sirens wailed in the distance. They robbed only 10 banks in their career, but each heist was an adrenaline rush, hearts thumping as the teller counted bills with shaking hands. On April 27, 1933, they kidnapped Dillard Darby and Sophia Stone in Ruston, Louisiana, while stealing Darby's car. Darby, a local farmer with fear in his eyes, and Stone, his wife, forced into the back seat as the car roared away. They released them later far away, with money for the trip home and a warning, "Don't say a word to the cops, or we'll come back." Kidnappings became their signature, cops taken and dumped miles away, pockets lined with cash and hearts filled with terror. On June 10, 1933, disaster struck near Wellington, Texas. The car crashed into a ravine at a bridge under repair. Metal screamed, and battery acid or gasoline exploded in a blaze, licking Bonnie's right leg. Third-degree burns from hip to ankle, pain like the devil's claws tearing at flesh. "The leg was gone. I saw the leg in places where it wasn't," Jones said later, voice filled with memory's horrors. She could barely walk, sobbing in pain as Clyde carried her through the night, shoulders tense with fear. They got help from a farm family who bandaged the wound with rags and herbs, but then kidnapped Collingsworth County Sheriff George Corey and City Marshal Paul Hardy, chaining them to a tree outside Eric, Oklahoma, handcuffs clicking like fate. "Forgive us, it wasn't meant to be," Bonnie whispered through tears, her voice broken. June 1933 saw more blood. Buck and Jones botched a robbery in Ulmer, Arkansas, on June 26, murdering Town Marshal Henry D. Humphrey in panic, his body slumping against the door with a thud. They fled to Fort Smith, Arkansas, to nurse Bonnie's wounds, but the shadows of the law closed in. In July 1933, they checked into the Red Crown Tourist, caught south of Platte City, Missouri, renting 2 cabins overlooking the dusty road. Their behavior drew eyes. Clyde backed into the garage, gangster style, paid with coins from robbed gumball machines. They taped newspapers over windows to block prying eyes, and Blanche wore jodhpurs like a movie star. Owner Neil Hauser alerted the Missouri Highway Patrol, suspicious of bandages Clyde bought for Bonnie's leg and atropine sulfate for the pain. On July 20, at 11 p.m., Sheriff Holt Coffey stormed in with officers armed with Thompson submachine guns, air thick with gunpowder and shouts. Clyde's bar overpowered them. Shots flew like hail, and a bullet shorted the horn on the armored police car, blaring loud, a mistake for ceasefire. They escaped in chaos, but Buck was hit in the forehead, brain exposed in a shocking wound, and Blanche nearly blinded by windshield glass shards, blood dripping from her face. On July 24, 1933, they camped at Dexfield Park, an abandoned amusement park near Dexter, Iowa, with Buck moaning in pain under a tree. Locals alerted police after spotting them. About 100 officers and onlookers surrounded them at dawn. Clyde, Bonnie, and Jones fled on foot through cornfields, stalks whipping their legs, breathless and terrified for their lives. Buck was shot in the back and captured with Blanche. He died 5 days later, on July 29, at King's Daughters Hospital in Perry, Iowa, from the head wound and pneumonia, his last breath a rattling sigh. For 6 weeks, the survivors, Clyde, Bonnie, and Jones, traveled through Colorado, Minnesota, and Mississippi, committing armed robberies on small stores where cashiers trembled in fear. On August 20, 1933, Barrow and Jones robbed an armory in Platteville, Illinois, stealing 3 bars, handguns, and ammunition that filled the car to the brim. Early September 1933, they visited families in Dallas for the first time in 4 months. Bonnie's leg wrapped in rags smelling of infection, Clyde's limp more pronounced than ever. Jones headed to Houston in November and was arrested on November 16, never returning to the gang. Fall 1933, Clyde robbed with local cronies while Emma and Cumie secretly nursed Bonnie. They'd later be sentenced to 30 days for harboring fugitives. On November 22, 1933, Clyde sensed a trap near Soers, Texas, set by Sheriff Smoot Schmid, Deputy Bob Alcorn, and Ted Hinton. They opened fire with machine guns and bars, bullets whistling through the air and hitting the car, wounding both Clyde and Bonnie in the legs, pain exploding like grenades, blood sticky on the seat. They drove on through the night, sirens wailing in the distance. On November 28, a Dallas grand jury indicted them for the January Davis murder, Bonnie's first murder charge, a brand that burned like fire. On December 21, 1933, they robbed a citizen in Shreveport, Louisiana, a simple theft leaving the victim shaken. 1934 turned the hunt into a fever dream of desperation. On January 16, Clyde staged the Eastham breakout, freeing Raymond Hamilton, Henry Methvin, and 3 others from Eastham Prison Farm with smuggled pistols. Inmate Joe Palmer shot Major Joe Croson in the chaos, who died days later from wound infection. This drew in all of Texas and federal agencies, with prison chief Lee Simmons vowing revenge. The Texas Department of Corrections hired retired Texas Ranger Captain Frank Hamer on February 10, 1934, as a special investigator, a man with 53 kills and 17 wounds under his belt, living in his car and tracking them relentlessly, predicting their circular routes across state lines. Easter Sunday, April 1, 1934, near Grapevine, Texas, now Southlake, at the intersection of Route 114 and Dove Road, they killed Highway Patrolman H.D. Murphy and Edward Bryan Wheeler with shotguns and handguns, Clyde and Methvin or Bonnie, firing from bushes, shots echoing through the quiet morning. A witness claimed Bonnie fired the fatal shots and laughed hysterically as Murphy's head bounced like a rubber ball on the road. A cigar stub with her small teeth marks was found at the scene. Methvin later said he fired first, with Clyde joining. Murphy's fiancée wore her wedding dress to the funeral, an image newspapers exploited for sensation. The Dallas Journal drew a cartoon of an empty electric chair labeled "Reserved for Clyde and Bonnie," and the reward rose to $1,500. Radio across the country warned in dramatic broadcasts, "They're devils in human form, protect your children, your homes." Public opinion turned against them, from romantic rebels to monsters. On April 6, 1934, they murdered Constable William Cal Campbell, 60 years old, near Commerce, Oklahoma, a shot to the chest during a roadblock, and kidnapped Police Chief Percy Boyd, releasing him in Kansas with a clean shirt, money in his pocket, and Bonnie's desperate plea. "Tell them I don't smoke cigars, please." Boyd identified them later, leading to more warrants. By May 1934, Clyde had 16 arrest warrants in 4 states for robbery, car theft, kidnapping, and murder. They were suspected of 13 murders total, including 2 officers in Joplin, Missouri, a man in Hillsborough, Texas, a deputy in Stringtown, Oklahoma, and more in Abilene, Sherman, Dallas, and Columbia, Missouri. The end in blood and lead. An ambush that echoes through history. May 1934 was the end drawing near, air thick with tension. Hamer's posse, Texas officers Hamer, Ted Hinton, Bob Alcorn, and B.M. Maney Gault, plus Louisiana officers Henderson Jordan and Prentice Morrell Oakley, learned on May 21 that Barrow and Parker planned to visit Ivy Methvin in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. Methvin, who had split in Shreveport, agreed to betray them by placing his truck as bait on Louisiana State Highway 154 south of Gippsland toward Sales. The posse waited from the evening of May 22 or 9 p.m. on May 23, hidden in bushes along the road, weapons loaded and hearts stone-hard. At 9:15 a.m. on May 23, 1934, Clyde slowed his 1934 Ford V8 upon seeing the truck, dust swirling under the tires. Oakley fired first, the bullet hitting Clyde in the head and severing his spine instantly. His body jerked, eyes glazing over. Bonnie screamed, a shriek slicing through the air like a knife, as the posse unleashed about 130 shots from automatic rifles, shotguns, and pistols, emptying magazines in a storm of lead. The car crashed into a ditch 50 yards away, riddled with 112 bullet holes. The coroner reported 17 entry wounds on Clyde, including the head shot, and 26 on Bonnie, several in the head, any one fatal. Inside lay over a dozen weapons, thousands of rounds, including 100 bar magazines, and 15 stolen license plates from various states. Hinton and Alcorn later said, "We fired with automatic rifles until they were empty, then shotguns. We kept shooting even after the car stopped. We took no chances." Hamer muttered with a voice full of reluctance, "I hate to bust up a woman, especially when she's sitting down." The bodies were taken to Conger Funeral Home in Arcadia, Louisiana, where thousands gathered to view them, a crowd pressing against ropes, curiosity mixed with revulsion. Emma Parker kissed Bonnie's forehead, tears falling on the cold skin. "My baby, my little star." Roy Thornton, Bonnie's legal husband from prison, said with bitter voice, "I'm glad they went out like they did. Better than being caught and hanged." Their story lived on in newspapers like the story of Bonnie and Clyde, a poem sung on streets by Depression's children, radio echoing with ballads of their love, and movies romanticizing the blood. They were Robin Hood figures to the poor, villains to the law, a love story written in blood under the Depression's shadow, eternal in memory as a warning and a dream. Epilogue: when the shots fell silent on the dusty country road in Louisiana on May 23, 1934, Bonnie and Clyde's wild ride ended in a storm of lead. They died as they lived, together in a car filled with weapons and memories. Their tale lived on as a ballad of rebellious love, inspiring films, songs, and myths. In the aftermath of the Depression, they became symbols for the outcasts, heroes to some, monsters to others, but eternally united in history as the ultimate ride-or-die lovers.
You've read the story of Jesse James, of how he lived and died. If you're still in need of something to read, here's the story of Bonnie and Clyde. Now Bonnie and Clyde are the Barrow Gang. I'm sure you all have read how they rob and steal, and those who squeal are usually found dying or dead. There's lots of untruths to these write-ups. They're not as ruthless as that. Their nature is raw. They hate all the law, the stool pigeons, spotters and rats. They call them cold-blooded killers. They say they are heartless and mean. But I say this with pride, that I once knew Clyde when he was honest and upright and clean. But the laws fooled around, kept taking him down and locking him up in a cell till he said to me, "I'll never be free, so I'll meet a few of them in hell." The road was so dimly lighted, there were no highway signs to guide. But they made up their minds if all roads were blind, they wouldn't give up till they died. The road gets dimmer and dimmer, sometimes you can hardly see, but it's fight man to man and do all you can, for they know they can never be free. From heartbreak some people have suffered, from weariness some people have died, but take all in all our troubles are small till we get like Bonnie and Clyde. If a policeman is killed in Dallas and they have no clue or guide. If they can't find a fiend, they just wipe their slate clean and hang it on Bonnie and Clyde. There's 2 crimes committed in America not accredited to the Barrow mob. They had no hand in the kidnap demand nor the Kansas City depot job. A newsboy once said to his buddy, "I wish old Clyde would get jumped. In these hard times we'd make a few dimes if 5 or 6 cops would get bumped. The police haven't got the report yet, but Clyde called me up today. He said, 'Don't start any fights, we aren't working nights, we're joining the NRA.' From Irving to West Dallas Viaduct is known as the Great Divide, where the women are kin and the men are men, and they won't stool on Bonnie and Clyde. If they try to act like citizens and rent them a nice little flat, about the 3rd night they're invited to fight by a subgun's rat-tat-tat. They don't think they're too smart or desperate, they know the law always wins. They've been shot at before, but they do not ignore that death is the wages of sin. Someday they'll go down together, and they'll bury them side by side. To few it'll be grief, to the law a relief, but it's death for Bonnie and Clyde.